to the UN Brief. Today we interviewed Dr. Emmanuel Letouzé. He is the co-founder of Data Pop Alliance and currently Marie Curie Fellow at the Universitat Pompeu Fabre in Barcelona. Thank you for watching and listening to the UN Brief, and don't forget to subscribe. It's my great pleasure to have here today at the UN Brief Dr. Emmanuel Letouzé. He is a Marie Curie Fellow at the University Pompeu Fabre in Barcelona. And we are going to be discussing his organization, Data Pop Alliance, and as well as data governance and the many issues around finance for development and the use of data. Thank you very much, Dr. Letouzé.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So what are some of the most pressing issues when we talk about data governance and finance for development?
So I think one of the big picture question is whether and how so data and the data revolution, new technologies will increase inequalities or will help reduce inequalities. So inequalities along different measures or metrics. So it can be income inequalities, it can be wealth inequalities, it can be educational inequalities. So in different spheres of life. So I think that is probably one of the biggest questions. And related to the question of inequalities, there's the question of polarization. There's the question of segmentation of societies.
Indeed, this is a field that is gathering much attention for the last decade or more, also with the revelations by Snowden of surveillance. And then there is the question, how to use private data that's held by companies, right, that are being used and exploited in ways that the general public wasn't aware, right, to the extent, and in the end, that you can actually trace back that data to a person. So there are so many issues right there. And the European Union is actually very active. It's called now the regulator of the world in terms of data governance. So what do you see is the role of the European Union, and why is all this hype around AI too? Because that is what it is, right? It's data being used in a certain way. Why are we seeing so much hype in the context a bit of what the European Union is doing in terms of regulatory measures?
Yeah, so a couple of points. So first, so you and we have to remember that it's a pretty new phenomenon. The rise of digital data, of these specific types of data, of personal digital data about our actions and interactions with digital devices. AI is both old and new. Likewise, I mean it's not new as a discipline, as a domain. It's about 60 plus years old, but it's just different now because the new kind of AI is data driven, and so that's the clear link between the rise or the generation and the collection of these new types of data and the new AI, which is not rule-based, which is really data-driven. So I think a lot of regulators around the world, and civil society organizations, policymakers, citizens, activists, so data subjects have been, have had to grapple with the implications of this new phenomenon and the different facets of this new phenomenon. I think we've done overall, a pretty decent job of developing guidelines, principles, regulations as well. So you mentioned or hinted at the GDPR that are rooted in other ethical principles. One can think of the ethical principles that came out of the Second World War about consent. In the field of medical research, the Menlo report is also a good framework. The principles for digital development that DIAL has put together, and of which several organizations, including Data Pipelines, are endorsers. And so I think the centerpiece, or one of the central concerns has been consent, control, awareness, involvement of data subjects. It's difficult. It's difficult because we don't really know what an AI system actually does necessarily with the data. So there's a bit this kind of like black box argument, although sometimes it's a bit overblown, I think. But also, a lot of us trust the tech platforms, the organizations that collect our data. We don't really have time to look at everything that's done. So there is a necessary level of trust that needs to be put in place. When the Facebook and then Cambridge Analytica scandals came to light, it was, I think, seen as a breach of trust, fundamentally. The question is, how can more people be more meaningfully engaged, involved in the use of data? And it's not about data ownership. There's a lot of discussion about, we should own our data and be able to sell them, etc. So which gets also to the financial or business model aspect. I don't think that's the right question. I think it would be very complicated for everyone to really own their data. It's in terms of having property rights, etc. It's more a question of general control, and it's a question of interest of people to demand that public policies, public decisions, the use of public money be based on better evidence. And I think that's the rationale. That should be the incentive, not really financial. I don't think it should be a direct financial incentive. It should be a kind of societal incentive where people would say, if I allow my data to be used, to be analyzed, then it is going to improve public policies.
For researchers, allow me to interrupt you for a minute. For researchers, what are the challenges there? Because you would like to access Facebook's data, and you are allowed to access certain data for research purposes, and you are allowed maybe by Twitter or whatnot. So, what are the challenges there for researchers in terms of how good is the data and how careful you have to be in terms of privacy?
So there are several types of challenges. First, one would have to define what we mean by Facebook data or Twitter data or credit card data, because they come in different forms at different stages of the kind of data processing. So Facebook, for instance, or Twitter do allow researchers to access some of their data. So it's not personal data in the sense that it's not PII. It is aggregated data. So there's already a bit of massaging and cooking and preparation that's been done. Facebook allows also researchers to access advertising data. So if you want to know the demographics, or if you want to have a kind of a demographic breakdown, you can use that tool, the advertising platform of Facebook, to have that. Then when you want to get, let's say, deeper, more fine-grained, so there have been questions and pilots and attempts at actually developing, in short, what are called privacy enhancing technologies. So technologies, and the UN has been working on that. There was an article recently in The Economist in January, 2022, if I'm not mistaken, about these PETS labs. We, as Data Pop Alliance, with others, have founded a project called the Open Algorithms Project, or OPAL, which aims at developing both technological systems to access and analyze very sensitive data. As a case in point, call detail records, so cell phone metadata, which are both very rich and very sensitive. So to develop technological systems, so privacy preserving systems and governance systems, such that you can actually have counterweight, you can have inclusion, involvement. But in short, you can think of the key challenges as being so technological, about access, how to access this data, what kind of technologies, what kind of software, what kind of hash you put in place. There are also political, ethical challenges that may actually lead some companies to say this is just too risky, also in terms of reputational risks. Mm-hmm. There are capacity challenges. Some organizations, some private sector companies don't really have the capacities to prepare, to clean, to anonymize the data. There are legal challenges. There are financial challenges. It costs money. There are questions of the business model. And I would say last, there are also cultural.
Purchasers, they have to purchase this data.
There are different business models. So for instance, some companies such as Orange and Vodafone, and Telefonica, Orange and Telefonica have developed services whereby, and so it's called respectively Fluvision and Smart Steps, where they have a division, if you want, that packages data, and then that would tell a region, say in France, if you want to plan for how many tourists will come, you can buy analysis, or you can buy data from our network that will help you model how many people move from Paris. So for example, network analysis, you see where people move physically, because most of these phones are GPS phones. You can also see who they call, or who the phone calls. So you could do also like network analysis that can help in terms of use cases. You can think, of course, of tourism, economic activity, educational needs, etc. Also in public health, you can see, for instance, in the way in which people use their cell phones, you can detect depression, like early onsets of depression, because when we get depressed, we tend to use our phones differently. So there's a whole range of applications. But to go back to the question of financing or the business model, so you have those models, those initiatives where basically, there's a fee for so many data points and the length and the granularity, etc. But for most companies, the business model is from reselling data to advertisers. So it's not it's a kind of like B2B kind of business. And the third model is more like ad hoc. Some organizations, telecom companies, for instance, if we reach out to them and say we want to do a project, say in Togo or in Liberia or in Sierra Leone or in Colombia, can we access your data? But don't share it with us on a USB stick, because that used to be done, but it's clearly not the right way to do it for many reasons. So can you pre-package? If you don't have a system like OPAL, for instance, in place, then you get into those kinds of discussions. You may or may not have to pay something. Typically, my experience is that it's typically pro bono.
Mm-hmm. For researchers like the DataPop Alliance.
Yes, for researchers, for national statistical offices,
it's for commercial
governments, NGOs. But some have said, it's not really sustainable because if it's free, then there isn't a very strong incentive. So maybe one thing to mention.
Companies have a cost in packaging this data as well.
Yeah, they have a cost. They have a reputational cost. They have to maintain the networks, etc. I should just mention, and I just want to say a few words about your question about AI and the buzz, etc., or the expectations that. So I'm part of an expert group of the European Commission, because you also talk about Europe, which in many ways I think is leading the way, and there's now the Data Act and many other pieces of legislations. So this expert group was so we were about 20, and we were tasked with writing a report for recommendations to the European Commission and Eurostat in particular about the sharing of private data so data collected by private companies such as banks, financial institutions, telecom operators, for official statistics. So it is really that big question of how can official statistical offices and systems in Europe and around the world tap into the insights, the knowledge, the information that are contained in these new kinds of data. So it's a very different model from the way, from censuses or surveys, which are fully controlled by these systems. So it's about all these different aspects that I talked about. What should there be a business model? What are the technological requirements? What should be the incentives? What are the cultural challenges, etc. So maybe just about the buzz about AI. So first, I think it's fair to say that there are both a lot of expectations and excitement, but also a lot of concerns and a lot of fears and everything in between. So you have people who are absolutely convinced that AI is going to solve the world's problems, from hunger to gender-based violence to overfishing and many SDGs. So, and others who say, well, it's the worst thing. We're going into surveillance capitalism.
And the doomsday scenarios where this data is already used in such a way that can be harmful for society and democratic values.
Yes, and usually what I've seen is that there aren't. It's improved, but there aren't many kind of like middle ground or discussions between those two groups. I do tend, I have to say, to agree. And maybe we'll talk about Elon Musk and Twitter in a couple of minutes, but I do tend to agree that there are lots of risks, lots of either unintended or uncomfortable consequences that the powerful don't really want to hear about when they advocate for techno solutionism, as I and others call it. But I do think that the expectation amongst some policymakers and activists is that it would be pretty nice if policy decisions were taken on the basis of better evidence. If you do something that is that can be shown to be harmful, to lead to bad outcomes, then we should do less of it. And so I think the rationale is that, well, AI can help us do that because we can better estimate, predict, project at finer levels of complexity and granularity. And so I think that's kind of like at least from a public policy and research standpoint, that's the excitement. For businesses, well, it's because it increases the business. It helps target ads, in a better way, provide better services, smart health, smart education, social media, apps.
Yeah, when it brings what supports society, right, and supports the livelihoods. But when it happens, as in certain situations where it creates violence and duplicates, amplifies violence, that is the issue, right, that we're grappling with. So it's really a question of safeguards. Yeah, you're saying that middle ground we have to find, instead of just saying doomsday theories or just say everything is going to be solved by technology.
Yeah, I think one concept that I find useful to think of the difference between narrow AI and general AI, and there are many narrow AI applications. So the algorithms of Instagram or Twitter and Facebook or Amazon runs is an example of a narrow AI that is able at different times in the whole value chain to optimize better using AI. But this is like a narrow AI.
You made a very interesting comment on The Economist's article about Elon Musk buying Twitter. Can you walk us through your arguments?
Yeah, so it's of course the question of whether it's a good thing or a bad thing that Elon Musk might, because it's not when we're talking today, it's not yet a
Right,
done deal.
and he already went back and said something about doing due diligence. So it's
yeah, it's about the fake accounts and
a publicity stunt for him in a way, and rallying his troops because he has a following. Or maybe he will find out that the 93 million people who follow him are actually just 40, and maybe of this 40, because you assign a value in marketing, to the quality of your followers. So I don't know. In any case, yeah, I thought you made a very cogent argument in terms of why we shouldn't have, one person only have so much power of a platform that shapes public discourse. Well, we have the problem with news organizations, or Jeff Bezos owns Washington Post and so on and so forth, and Facebook owns Instagram and WhatsApp. So what is the challenge there?
So yeah, so at first I didn't really engage, and everybody has an opinion, and so I thought, well, I don't have any anything very clever or new to say. But then there was this specific article where, so in The Economist, as you mentioned, where there was one line that said, well, the fact that Mr. Musk is a billionaire should not, I don't remember exactly the phrasing, but should let's say should not mean that he shouldn't be allowed own,
that shouldn't be a front. Yeah.
So, which I thought, I just, sorry.
No, go ahead. Yes, because it's your argument I was going to quote.
And so I thought, well, I think it does. And so in short, so there are other reasons which are related, but there are other reasons why you might think that it's not a good idea. What he says about so what Elon Musk says about what he wants to do, his vision for this digital public sphere, agora, where it's freedom of expression, like full on, etc., etc. And I believe in democracy as government by discussion, and I think that this discussion should be civil. And so I don't believe in democracy as being first about elections. I think it's something that we do every day. It's about interacting, it's about engaging, it's about seeing and accepting to some extent different perspectives and coming to a sort of like a consensus based on or stemming from discussion. But it's not 5 minutes for the fascists and 5 minutes for the Nazis, if you want to make and 5 minutes for the victims. That's not democracy. I think democracy is about first, let's get rid, it's a bit of a strong term, but somehow of the fascists, and then we can talk and we can disagree. But yeah, so it's bounded. I had a fundamental disagreement with this notion that it should not be moderated, or it should be very lightly moderated, etc. Because I don't think that's not my vision of.
Yeah, I think that's the problem with Musk. I mean, he's a bright man. He's charming and all, and this and that, but he doesn't understand political processes. I'm sorry, there is a learning curve there, Elon. If you want to really do something, you should surround yourself by people who are understanding all these dynamics, academics, specialists. You cannot just say, oh, because his ideas are from like I don't know, he got in some sort of pamphlet from the fascists. What is it? What is free speech? My impression is that his understanding of political processes is very scant. I mean, I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt, you see, not just crucifying and seeing him as a bad person. I think he's ill-informed.
Okay, but that's an interesting argument. So the first argument or objection that I had, let's say, was his take on free speech. So that's one. The second is indeed that that I don't think. But this is a very kind of personal of mine, that yes, I don't think he's someone who deeply understands the world. So I made a comment which was maybe a bit self-serving or self-aggrandizing, saying that a lot of people in tech are very, very egoistic, very like, macho. They tend to speak one language, which is American, or sorry, English, but and I know he was born in South Africa, but he comes from this particular worldview. And if I think of the work that Datapop and I do in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East and North Africa, I mean, there are just so many complexities and sensitivities, etc., that I don't think he's fully equipped to understand. So does that suggest that I think I'm better equipped? I don't know. It's not the point, but it's just that I don't think so. That's in a sense is a more like personal argument that he's not kind of like fit to lead or to have such power. But I don't think that's the main argument.
But anyone, no one, I mean, should have so much power, right?
And I think that's the third argument. And so the crux of my argument is, so I'm a political scientist, let's say, and development economist and demographer by training. So I go back often to the fundamental kind of like foundational seminal books that I read when I was a student. And so there is, for instance, The Great Transformation by Karl Polanyi. There is Spheres of Justice by Michael Walzer. There is The Theory of Justice by John Rawls. There's also like Amartya Sen, and there are a couple others. And I think a key takeaway is that this notion of spheres of justice for me has been fundamental in how I kind of like view the world. Is that we need to have, so it's some version of separation of power. We need to have spheres of influence and power and assets that do not completely overlap and probably sometimes do not intersect. So political power, health assets, educational assets, social protection, culture, freedom of expression, etc. And that allows for for opportunities in societies, capabilities. So that's the term of Amartya Sen, to be shared and not concentrated in the hands of a few. If all the spheres completely overlap, then it leads to abuses and it leads to authoritarian regimes. And indeed, you mentioned Jeff Bezos. You mentioned I have a fundamental problem in that respect with wealthy people, so who have a lot of assets in one of the spheres, using these assets to kind of buy off or to gain influence in other spheres. So buying education for their kids, buying private health insurance. So it means that everything is driven by one of these spheres, which and then tends to like almost like infect all the other spheres of cells. So in closing, I would say, even if Elon Musk were, let's say, Gandhi or Mandela, I wouldn't want him to have control over Twitter because it's almost irreversible. And who knows, he can lose his mind. He can be, the subject of blackmail. He can, of course, the more like obvious risk is that he can use his influence over Twitter to push a certain political agenda, and there's no safeguards. There's no plan B. There's no way, or hardly any way, to pull the plug. You can put some regulation in place. So that's, for me, the main argument. It is that necessary separation of spheres of assets and life. And I think overall, we are in a world where these spheres intersect and overlap way too much.
Thank you for watching and listening to the UN Brief, and don't forget to subscribe